I'm going to be using the original notes of the founding meeting of the Society in Indianapolis, despite the fact that this is no recruiting meeting for the Society in any way, and we're not even trying to arrive at the same purpose as was the purpose of that meeting. But nevertheless, I'm going to use the same notes that were used then 7 years ago as the thread on which to hang this discussion. So a certain amount of repetition of what you have heard in earlier presentations will be inevitable for some of you. But I hope and believe that the additions of new material, the digressions and the tangents will be of a quantity and character to keep those parts with which you are already familiar from becoming boring. We shall explore some new fields entirely. And now, with these amenities and explanations out of the way, let's plunge ahead on our journey. And I always begin any seminar like this by pointing out that the bearer of bad news throughout all history has been a most unpopular person. And I certainly am not seeking any garlands of popularity these days, for I have now been spending for several years and am spending my whole life spreading bad news every day, everywhere I can. But a man who was to me one of the most profound of all Americans, Ralph Waldo Emerson, once said that every mind must make its choice between truth and repose. It could not have both. Today, you ladies and gentlemen have left your choice somewhat in my hands, and I'm not only bringing you truth instead of comfort, but truth which may shatter a lot of any remaining comfort that you still feel. For the truth I am bringing you is simple, incontrovertible, and deadly. It is that unless we can reverse forces which now seem inexorable in their movement, we have only a few more years before the country in which we live will become 4 separate provinces in a worldwide communist dominion ruled by police state methods from the Kremlin. The map for their division and administration has been drawn and in existence for many years. We are living in America today in exactly the same kind of fool's paradise as the people of China lived in 25 years ago, as the people of Czechoslovakia lived in 18 years ago, as the people of North Vietnam lived in 10 years ago, as the people of Iraq lived in 7 or 8 years ago, and the people of Cuba only 5 years ago. Now, to illustrate and support this statement, I'm going to ask you to look for a little while with me at some tedious and perhaps even painful history. For as George Santayana so brilliantly pointed out, those who will learn nothing from history are condemned to repeat it. Now, our whole purpose is to have enough people learn enough from history so that we do not have to repeat its horrors. This Cold War in which we are engaged is certainly no game. It's a fatal struggle for freedom against slavery, for existence against destruction, but we can use the analogy of a game nevertheless. And I want to show you, right on the clear record about which there can be no reasonable argument, how far that game has progressed and what the score is today. Now, to do that, we go back to 1917, when the contest started more or less in its present form. As most of you know, the contest had already been going on for a long time by 1917. The first communist revolution in Russia was led by Trotsky in 1905, and the sizable efforts of the conspiracy go back far beyond that. But for the discussion that we want to enter now, why we begin this story in 1917, when the contest took its present, more or less, visible form. In this year, 1917, Lenin was able, with Trotsky and only a few hundred other followers, to take the Russian Revolution out of the hands of its earlier leaders and to convert it into a communist strike for power. In 1918, they established some degree of stability and recognition for their rule by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. And by 1922, they had extended their infiltration, terror, and control enough to establish the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. It's worth remembering that date. In 1957, our then president was sending glowing telegrams, private telegrams, so as to make them more personal, to the head of the Soviet Union in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the USSR. And in my opinion, his morals were as faulty as his history, both completely faulty, because the Soviet Union was not founded in 1917 at all. It was founded in 1922. At that time, they were able to bring into this USSR, besides the greatly reduced Russia proper, which had been left them at the time of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the further areas of Russian Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And this combination, ladies and gentlemen, was the base. This was it. They didn't take over any more physical country until 1939, 39 and 40. This was the base from which Lenin and his successors set out deliberately and determinedly to conquer the whole world. Now, Lenin died in 1924, but before he died, he had laid down for his followers the strategy for this conquest of the world. And it was, we should readily admit, brilliant, far-seeing, realistic, and majestically simple. It has been paraphrased and summarized as follows. First, they said, we shall take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Now let me remind you, I said that it had been summarized and paraphrased. We have an unfortunate habit among some of our good fellow conservatives of running off into situations without sufficient research. And you have probably seen that statement quoted many, many times as a statement by Lenin. Of course, Lenin never said it. Don't ever use it in quotes. It's perfectly all right to use it and explain that this was an excellent summarization of the strategy, which it was. But nowhere can you find any record, or can anybody else find any record, that Lenin ever made that statement. And I am quite sure in my own mind of what happened. It's the same thing that happened with regard to another so-called quotation, which has even been far more widely misused. You see on a great many letterheads, the quotation, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, Edmund Burke. And of course, Burke never said it at all. Nobody can prove or find that quotation. It isn't there. I had an occasion to look into it a few years ago. Two different friends of mine, in 1 week, called me. I had long-distance telephone calls, and one of them, Lloyd, was Eddie Webster. And there was one other from another part of the country. Said, Bob, we're getting ready to start a certain little, whatever it was, organization. We want to use this quotation from Burke, but we don't know where it is. Can you tell us where it is? And I said, no, I can't tell you where it is. I've never used it because I never trusted it. I don't know, but I'll try to find out if I can. So, business I was, I took the time to look into it, and what happened is obvious. In a speech Burke made fairly early in his career called Reflections on the Causes of Our Present Discontent, there are two paragraphs which, if you take them and summarize them and paraphrase them, this is the effect of what he said. So somebody somewhere said, Edmund Burke said that all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, which is quite true. Somebody else picked it up and put quotation marks around it, and off it went. And it's been there ever since, and it's a nuisance and an embarrassment because it's not a quotation from Burke at all. Do not ever use that quotation from Lenin in quotes because it's not a quotation. Nevertheless, let me repeat, it is an accurate summary of the strategy which was laid down, that first we shall take Eastern Europe, next the masses of Asia, then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Now, to make doubly clear what he meant and how firmly he meant it, with regard to the order of these steps, with regard to taking Asia ahead of Western Europe and then using Asia as a stepping stone and base from which to conquer Western Europe and the rest of the world, the strategy was also stated that for the communists, the road to Paris, that's from Moscow, the road from Moscow to Paris led through Peking and Calcutta. And they followed that pattern. Today, of course, you can easily see how that road from Moscow to Paris has led all the way out to Peking and back through Calcutta, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Algiers to the encirclement, infiltration, and takeover of Western Europe, which right now is going on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are many remarkable things about that three-step strategy, but the most remarkable is that the communists have never wavered from it one iota. Through famines, which the communists deliberately caused, as in the Ukraine, you remember, in order to collectivize agriculture, through whatever industrialization they really have achieved instead of all of their pretenses, through wars which they have cleverly and cold-bloodedly brought on and prolonged for the help of such wars in their plans, through periods of peace and prosperity elsewhere in the world, through power struggles within the Kremlin itself, through apparent changes and reversals in the party line that make non-communist heads like yours and mine swim in confusion, through every upheaval and opportunity, the communists have always kept their eyes unwaveringly on this strategy and on plans to carry it out. They've let nothing stand in their way and nothing divert them. Now, they have used the philosophy of socialism as an ideological weapon whenever they could and for whatever it was worth. But it was only one of their many weapons. They have also used bribery, lies, bluff, brutality, the countless tentacles of treason, murder on a scale never before dreamed of in the world, and every possible means to advance them on this road without the slightest concern for any moral difference in those various means. And above all, ladies and gentlemen, they have used patience. A patient gradualism has been the most important key to the communists' overwhelming success. Now, it's worth pausing there for a minute to point out how important that is to them. It's the key to their great deception. One of the pieces of their strategy that's most important is the one long step forward and the two short steps backward, or at least a shorter step backward. They don't care whether it's one or two backward, whether it's a short step before and a short step after, the long step forward, or both before or both after. But they do carry it out, and they are too professional. They are battling for rule of the world. They're not kidding anybody, so they don't kid themselves ever. When they take the step backwards, it is an honest step backwards. They don't try to pay off in counterfeit coin. And this explains so much that goes on in Washington that is so hard to understand. You'll see some agency of our government in Washington do something that is a tremendous help to the communists. You'll say, well, they're gone too. Obviously, the communist influences inside that agency, that department, are so great that they're just running things for the benefit of the communists. And then 3 weeks later, or maybe 6 weeks later, but not more than that, that same agency will take some step which definitely hurts the communists, or appears to, which is very harmful to the communist advance. And you look into it, if you're careful, and study it very carefully, and you'll find that, no kidding, it definitely does hurt the communists, and very seriously. They want it that way. They don't try to pay off in counterfeit coin. Of course, what happens is you see that and you say, well, I must have been wrong. I guess it was the big step for the communists was just a mistake on their part, stupidity, they were misguided. Obviously, they have good intentions, or they wouldn't have done this. And of course, it isn't true. That's what they want you to believe. They take that step backward as against the long forward, as long as they make a profit on the whole transaction. They do it in every field of endeavor. They've been doing it for decades. It's a necessary part of the great deception. And it will explain a lot of things that otherwise seem utterly inexplicable that go on, as I say, in Washington and many other places. Now, the first great break for the communist conspiracy came in 1933 with our formal recognition of Stalin's regime. At that time, the Russian government was staying alive financially from week to week by methods which, in the case of individuals like you and myself, would be called the kiting of checks. The only time in all history, in the case of any supposedly sizable government power, where they were that desperate in resorting to actually check kiting just to stay alive week to week. Incidentally, in many of the things that come up here, I can give you the story in one book, so I'll try to remember to mention them. The very man who was handling the picture at that time was Tokayev. Tokayev later wrote a book called Stalin Means War. The book is available. I wouldn't trust Tokayev as far as you could throw this building with your left finger. And even when he was supposed to be a defector of our side, and you don't know how truthful the book is. But nevertheless, just from the facts that are in it, or the background that's in it, you can realize what they were up against financially by reading Tokayev's book. Now, our recognition tremendously increased their prestige and credit at home and with other nations. It saved them from financial collapse, and it enabled them greatly to increase their nests of spies and propaganda agents in this country and elsewhere in the world. You remember that a part of the deal was that if we would recognize them as another legitimate power and do business with them, Wyszynski assured us that there would be no more spying, and they would not have their espionage agents in this country and so forth. And of course it meant absolute nothing, typical of the communists, just a complete lie. And they hadn't more than got the ink dry on the papers before all of that communist nest, the whole crowd up in Montreal that was just waiting, all streamed in here in a stream, and most of them got on our Social Security payroll for the way of making their living. The Social Security payroll was padded with communists from the very early days. Now, as I say, a lot of them came out of Montreal. Now, their second great break for the communists came with the beginning of World War II, which was largely brought on through the worldwide diplomatic conniving of Stalin's agents for the advantages of making Russia a wartime ally of the Western nations, and for the sake of the chaos and resulting opportunities which Stalin knew the war would provide to the communists. And anybody who doubts that hardly needs to study anything more than the incredible ramifications and accomplishments of just the Sorge spy ring, where you will learn the truth of the statement. And incidentally, you can get that story pretty complete in one book, General Willoughby's Shanghai Conspiracy. Ralph de Toledano has quite a bit of it in one of his later books too, but Willoughby's Shanghai Conspiracy, which we publish incidentally in the dollar reprint, so you can get it from American Opinion for $1, and it'll give you the story. Now, with the war once underway, Stalin was able, through the influence of his agents in foreign countries, including our own, to keep the eyes and the anger of the civilized world focused on the crimes of Hitler, while he himself was perpetrating conquest and crime continuously and successfully that far outdid anything Hitler had ever dreamed of. But in this progress, Stalin always kept his aim exactly on the goals that had been set forth by Lenin. And the tallies of his advance now began to flash on this scoreboard of ours pretty thick and fast. In August 1939, as a result of his temporary compact with Hitler, Stalin seized all of eastern Poland. This, you'll remember, is the first seizure of any more territory since Lenin's death in 1924. As I said, they had taken that USSR base and gone ahead from there until they got a lot of other things straightened out and ready. Then they began to move ahead. In 1939 and 1940, through brutal conquest by force of arms, and incidentally the last time the communists ever used force of arms to take over territory, and this was against some very tiny countries right around them, and where Stalin had given his personal word less than 2 years before to respect and maintain their independence. They did go in there with a certain amount of infiltration inside, but brutal force too, and took over the Karelian Isthmus of Finland and swallowed up all of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, it's true that most of these conquests were temporarily taken out of Stalin's hands by the Germans during the World War that immediately followed, but they reverted to him as the Germans were driven back in 1944. And although the war had supposedly been fought, in the beginning anyway, over the territorial integrity of Poland and other small nations, the communist influence among the Western Allies was so great that as early as the Tehran Conference in 1943, it was made clear that when the fighting was over, Stalin was going to be allowed to keep everything he had stolen. Now, it's worth pausing over that for a minute to indicate, to note just how completely the Americans were being led by the nose. The only reason ever given you in the Atlantic Declaration of what it was caused by Stalin and Roosevelt for our going to war in Europe was to support the British in their reason for going to war, which was to support the territorial integrity of small nations. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Stalin had just taken over Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, as I say, in violation of his own personal word, and we didn't do a thing about it, pay any attention or anything. But the minute they could have the war go the way Stalin wanted it, we go to war on Stalin's side on that excuse that we are doing it to support the integrity of small nations. I mean, the American people just being absolutely led by the nose blindly to ignore the worst part and look at a smaller part because it depended on who the culpable party was. And the supposed reason for the war, the only reason ever given the American people, was gradually lost in the course of all the propaganda that took place during the next few years about our wonderful, noble allies, the Soviets. Now, to look at this development on the scoreboard that came then thick and fast, by the Tehran Conference in 1943, it was accepted, that Stalin was going to be allowed to keep everything he had stolen, and he was. And a new series of conquests then started immediately. Now, the formal flaunting to the world of these conquests occurred as follows. In January 1946, Stalin's henchmen proclaimed their People's Republic in Albania. And there again, it's worth stopping to say why. It's quite a long story. Why Albania the first? Well, one thing, it was a little country. It was easy to take over. But there are many more reasons. The communists are always looking far ahead. Albania was of extreme importance to them to get it and get started very early. They were looking ahead, particularly to the use of the divisions over religious and racial and color lines, which they always used. Even then, with regard to the Middle East. We'll talk more about that later. They were planning what they were going to do in the Middle East as far back as 1946. Stalin was. Albania was extremely important to them because it was the one Mohammedan country in Europe. 60 to 80% of the population of Albania is Mohammedan. And so here they were getting a base among Mohammedans for all the work they were going to do with the Mohammedans in the Middle East. In the second place, the only, in my opinion, military prowess of any kind the communists have ever had. The rest of it is all either lies or stuff they've stolen from us. The only thing on their own is the submarine fleet. And Jane's fighting ships has said for years that they had submarine fleet equal to, greater than that of all the rest of the submarines of the world combined. And Jane's has been a pretty reliable source for a couple of generations, and I would believe them. And they have had because they kidnapped those German scientists and producers and built a submarine fleet. Well, of course, Trieste is the finest place in the world to base a submarine fleet for the whole Mediterranean and with regard to North Africa and the Middle East. Now, that's another reason. They were looking ahead so far. You remember, in support of this, they always do, in support of this complete fraud, this fiction about the break between Soviet Russia and the Red Chinese. And of course, we started publishing 7 or 8 years ago articles by Rodney Gilbert to show how ridiculous it was. Rodney Gilbert spent 15 years in the Far East as a representative of the New York Herald Tribune when it was still a newspaper. And he spent 40 years over there altogether, and nobody knew the area better. And after giving all the reasons, and I can give you a lot more and show you now and show you what tremendous advantage this fiction is to them, Rodney Gilbert said as far as believing any slightest idea of any real split between the Soviets and the Red Chinese, the truth of it is that whoever's in charge of the Kremlin can pick up the telephone and fire everybody in the Chinese Red government any day he wants to, but telephone. There's no slightest doubt about it. Some of the advantages this thing's been to them so far are tremendous, and of course they're counting on far greater advantages eventually, and we'll come to later. But in helping to build this up even, the Chinese are Mongolian, Albanians are Muslim. When they were trying to build it up a few years ago, you remember that they had Albania was the one country in Europe where Enver Hoxha began to thumb his nose supposedly at Khrushchev. And Albania was saying, well, we're good communists, but we don't like the way we're being bossed around by the Kremlin. So right away, Mao Zedong and the Soviets say, fine, bully boys, that's good, we'll follow you. We don't like them being so bossy either. And that's grand. And what's more, in order to strengthen your backbone, your spine, we're going to send you some troops. We're going to send some, because you're a small country and we're a big country, and we're going to send some armed forces over there and to make you able to thumb your nose at the Kremlin a little more. And of course, Washington and London, being all in on this, unfortunately, all part of the same game, said, wonderful. This is grand. Isn't it wonderful to see all this split developing? So bad that Red China is willing to send troops to Albania to make it be more able and willing to stand up to Khrushchev. Well, of course, the idea was to get Red Chinese troops on the soil of Europe without any blow-up, without any fuss. This was an excuse to do it, because when the time comes to use police state force in some parts of Europe, they're going to need Red Chinese troops. They can't trust the native people to enforce the police state against their own neighbors. That's why, jumping way ahead, our support your local police action in this country has been so terrifically important. The centralized government in Washington could never count on the local police forces in different areas to enforce the police state against their neighbors. They've got to send in troops from somewhere else, and when it gets too far, they're going to probably have troops from some other countries. Just as when the United Nations crowd went into Katanga, they had to send in mercenaries from other parts of the world. Just as in Budapest in 1956, Khrushchev didn't dare trust even his own Russian communist troops to take those tanks into Budapest. They used Mongolians manning those tanks that didn't even know where they were or what they were fighting about or anything. And all over the world, they've always had the problem they cannot trust their own people to impose the police state on their friends and neighbors. So, as they go further towards a rigid enforcement in Europe, they are going to need Chinese communist troops and others. And this is just a sort of a minor thing in this picture, but the communists always pick up every possible angle they can use, is that on this fictitious split, Albania comes out on the side of the Red Chinese to give an excuse to send Chinese communist troops into Albania and have us, our government and London and so forth, all applaud and say wonderful. And of course it's a way of ruining Western Europe. There are other angles to this Albanian question, Albanian development, why they took it over first, but that's all I should stop for now. So let's go back to the scoreboard, the series of conquests that occurred beginning in January 1946. During the course of 1946, the communists established themselves as the government of Hungary, with the brutal execution of Hungarian patriots who had resisted the Germans and now resisted the Russians. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that picture, but there is one of the most horrible parts of the Eisenhower record. The general was an extremely important part of this killing off in Hungary in 1946 of the real patriots who had fought the Germans, but who were now willing to fight the Russians to keep the Russian communists from taking over their country. And some of their lives were lost on the specific orders of Eisenhower. Now, in July 1946, to go ahead with the conquest, Stalin's hatchet man, Tito, completed his crushing grasp of Yugoslavia by the public shooting of Mihailovich. One of the best friends, of course, that America ever had in Central Europe. He'd saved the lives of a lot of our flyers at the risk of his own men and sometimes the loss of his own men. We had even a few hundred of our flyers who fought desperately to go back to Yugoslavia to testify for him, to do anything. Of course, our State Department wouldn't let them go. They were supporting Tito in every way. They had built Tito up, London and Washington together. But an interesting thing about this trial of Mihailovich, so-called trial, was its repetition many years later, almost exactly, except for the results not quite the same, in the trial of General Salan by de Gaulle. Same kind of a picture. De Gaulle wouldn't even allow the Muslim officers in the French army to come in and testify on behalf of Salan. They wouldn't even allow other French officers. De Gaulle couldn't keep President Coty and a few of the very top from doing so. But he did everything he could to prevent even the Muslims from testifying on behalf of Salan. And he was determined to have Salan executed, exactly as Tito had been determined to have Mihailovich executed, and for the same kind of reasons exactly. De Gaulle couldn't get away with it despite everything. The officers just wouldn't do it. There had been an awful lot of the French army that had followed what they call the route of discipline and had refused to go over to the OAS, although certainly the best of the French army went into the OAS under Salan. You remember, Salan was not betrayed for ideological reasons. The Muslims in Algeria were completely behind him. He was betrayed for a huge price paid by de Gaulle to a major, I believe he was, in the army, and a Muslim who'd been a good personal friend of Salan for years, who betrayed him for money. But anyway, the trial was exactly like the Mihailovich trial. They didn't quite get away with it. They refused to sentence Salan to death, and de Gaulle was so mad, you remember, and so disappointed, and it was such a setback to him that he immediately set up a second court to try Salan all over again, something completely contrary to our ideas of jurisprudence. And he appointed a new court to try Salan. I've forgotten whether it was for the first court or the second. He promoted a sergeant all the way to general in order to get him on the court to try Salan. And you'll find that in the records. And first or second. Well, anyway, the second trial didn't even come off because the man he appointed as chairman of the tribunal to try Salan the second time, a very able French general, committed suicide rather than go through with it. But the kind of pressures that were put by de Gaulle to get Salan executed were exactly similar to those used by Tito to get Mihailovich executed. The same kind of setting, except that it didn't quite work. Salan is still alive, and Salan's lawyer, the man who handled the case all the time. Of course, it was incredibly dirty. Salan is a man who's meticulous with notes on everything. They wouldn't let him touch his notes. Everything he testified had to be purely from memory for a man who all his life had kept notes on everything in the world. But his lawyer, who handled it so brilliantly, Thiers-Vignancourt, is running against de Gaulle for the presidency. You see almost nothing about him in the United States papers. He doesn't have any chance, but he's still putting up quite a fight, but you'd never know it over here. And of course, as some of you people know, the administrative campaign manager for Thiers-Vignancourt is Connecdu that we had speak at our last council meeting. And the lawyer who handled this Salan case was Thiers-Vignancourt. Now, get back from that digression, yet I think it's worthwhile because these patterns, as we will come to later, the big ones, the strategy plans, the tactical efforts, every little kind of plank in them, all repeat themselves over and over and over. And this was a repetition. Now, to go back to the advance of the communists in Central Europe, following that first strategic step of Lenin's in 1946, in November 1946, Stalin's agents took over Romania and Bulgaria. In January 1947, the mock elections in Poland formally completed the 2 years of incredibly cruel subjugation of that nation to Stalin's Lublin gang. One of the foulest bunches of murdering traitors that any country ever had was the Lublin gang, set up by Stalin in Warsaw in the middle of 1945. And as I say, they finished the takeover in January 1947 with those mock elections that caused Arthur Bliss Lane to resign and come home. We'll mention it later in another connection. But the thing here to mention is that after 1956 and the Poznan riots, when the excuse was used that we were going to help the government of Poland a great deal and give them money so to break them away from Russia, now that they had this new government, and how the Kremlin had to liberalize a bit and let a good man like Gomulka, who'd been in jail because they didn't like him, let him become the premier. And I don't doubt they had gone through the pretenses of having him in jail, ladies and gentlemen. They do this kind of thing regularly. They did it with Milovan in Yugoslavia later for the same kind of a reason, though not the same one. But anyway, we got all this propaganda about how Gomulka, of course, he was different. We ought to support Gomulka. And as a matter of fact, we did give them a lot of money. And we published, we here as now our own people, published the fact that this money was being used, for goodness sakes, to improve their mining equipment to ship coal, which as a slave nation they had to do, to ship coal to Russia. That's what the money that we gave Gomulka was being used for. That's how much they've broken away. But the thing is that caused me to bring it up, it makes it also horrible, is that Gomulka had been second in command of the original Lublin Committee that established the whole Lublin-Warsaw regime, the provisional government of in 1945 to 1947 of Poland. He was the second in command. He's the man that we were trying to say, well, he's different from the others. Anyway, in January 1947, they had those mock elections. They completed the subjugation, the formal subjugation of Poland. In February 1948, Stalin's lieutenants in Czechoslovakia pulled their coup d'etat and formally placed that country behind the Iron Curtain. And in October 1950, Stalin's lackeys formalized their puppet state of East Germany. Now, by this time, of course, there were other takeovers going on in other parts of the world, as we shall soon see. But we're dealing here only with Europe, and East Germany finished the job there as it had been planned by Lenin 26 years before. Except for the tiny country of Greece, which really was saved by Boristal, and the city of Istanbul. With those very tiny exceptions, the communists now had Eastern Europe entire, and the first step of their three-step program was complete. Now next, you remember, was Asia. And there's one thing among a great many for which you have to give the communists credit. While they're working on a particular task, and no matter how difficult it may be, they never cease looking ahead or preparing for the tasks that are to follow. Although they were fully adjusted to the importance of taking Eastern Europe first, nevertheless they began their infiltration and work in Asia, especially in China, almost before the blood of the 1917 revolution had grown cold in the streets of Moscow. Now, of course, we can't take time here to go into the ruses, plans, deceptions, betrayals, and epic cruelties by which the communists eventually were able to make their power felt increasingly in Asia. It took them a long time. Not until they had the full help of our government, completely misled by communist influences both during World War II and immediately after that war, were the communists successful in Asia on any sizable scale or in any formal manifestations. But their successes then came thick and fast, and we'll now look at that sequence. So to all of the chancelleries of Asia, to all of the Asiatics in the governments who knew anything at all, the 38th parallel was the final boundary of imperial Russian power under the Tsars, farthest it ever got. And here we handed to the communists on a silver platter, right up to the 38th parallel, the extension of their power in 1948 to the ultimate limit that the Russian Tsars had ever reached. It was an incredibly terrific piece of value to the communists that they got much more than they'd taken all of Korea, because that sort of muddied up the psychological effect. But here they were up to the 38th parallel in Korea, which every East Asian knew, every East Asian who was literate enough to know anything about government knew, had been the limit that the Tsars had ever reached. That was a part of the picture as to why. And of course, when Dean Acheson was asked before a congressional committee, why on earth did they divide Korea at the 38th parallel? And he said, well, my understanding is that some major in the Pentagon had to be aligned someplace, and he reached up and pulled it out of his hat. And so when somebody explained just what I've been reminding you people of, the significance of the 38th parallel and what it meant, and Dean Acheson said, well, I was not informed on that matter. Well, they want divided countries. You should remember that time after time when the communists have had a chance to take over a whole country, they don't want it all. The communists could just as easily have had all of Vietnam in 1954. Sitting around the table there in Geneva, with the Red Chinese sitting on in it after Dulles had said he wouldn't possibly let them sit in on that conference. And then he goes to Manila and announces that he will, where the American press doesn't get it, but the Asiatic press does, and play it up at least. As they sat around that table after Dien Bien Phu, why, they could just as well have had the whole thing, because we'd driven the French out and we were ready to turn it over to the communists. They didn't want but half of it. The same thing with regard to Korea. The same thing in other cases. The same thing probably with regard to China, though it's not so clear. It seems fairly possible that in 1950, the Chinese could have gone ahead to Formosa and driven Chiang Kai-shek into the sea. They wanted the divided country. It creates that fight that goes on. They have to have fights going on all the time so that they can prosper and profit and gain out of the fact that there is a fight going on and a struggle. Anyway, they didn't want all of Korea for that basic reason, but for a far more specific reason. The communists in 1948 were already planning the Korean War and what was to be done about it and how it was to be fought and everything about it and what gains they were to get out of it, which were terrific. As a means, as they eventually did, of showing the Asiatics that they could twist the tail of the paper tiger, as they call the United States, and of breaking down our prestige and moral leadership and doing a great many other things, which they would have done even more effectively for themselves if MacArthur hadn't been as able as he was and willing to do things without trusting Washington to some extent, and succeeded in throwing somewhat of a monkey wrench in their plans, but not too much. They accomplished almost everything they set out to accomplish with the Korean War, which was a terrific blow to our prestige and leadership and a buildup of the Red Chinese and so forth. In 1948, the communists set up their government in North Korea. They let Syngman Rhee come back in. He'd been trying like everything to fight on our side. He was just worshipped by the Korean people, as he had reason to be. He'd earned it, certainly. Let him go back in and set up South Korea and go through the Republic of Korea in South Korea, and go through some motions of being able to make progress as an independent nation, all so that we would have something to defend, so that there'd be an appearance we had something to defend worthwhile. Just as right now there has been for 2 or 3 years, ladies and gentlemen, a terrific pretense, and it's all you can dig it as phony as can be, to indicate that in Vietnam there had been really a putting down of the communists and a build-up of the anti-communists up to 1960, so that we have something worth defending. Absolutely, if you dig into all the facts, utterly untrue. The Paris Herald Tribune only 6 weeks ago published a short little article. They hadn't intended it to have this significance that it did, that how wonderful it was at last that our soldiers over there were now attacking a certain position which had been continuously in communist hands since 1954, since we were supposed to put people in that would make it anti-communist. And this position had been in communist hands continuously since 1954. Now we were attacked, all of which is true. But you look at the map, the place was only 30 miles from Saigon. Here's a spot 30 miles from Saigon that's been in communist hands ever since 1954, through all this pretense we've had that the country was being saved from the communists. Well, this thing has been built up over the last 2 or 3 years terrifically, so that it looked like we had something worth defending. We had something there. When the time came to pull us into this more and more and more and more war with the Red Chinese of an exact Korean pattern, which they are trying to bring us into now, and the administration in Washington is leading us into all the time, with all the help of the communist propaganda agents, to make it look like we are standing up to the Red Chinese and the communists over there. I'm getting too far off the track. We'll come back to that from another point of view presently, but the thing is that in Korea, they let Syngman Rhee have some help, and helped to build him up and make it look like he was establishing an independent country, although all the industry was north of the border and they had nothing from Seoul down, and it was an impossible situation. They let it look like there was something there, so that give some more sense to, some more plausibility to our going in to help to defend South Korea, as if we had something. We did have it. You'd given Syngman Rhee a chance. Anyway, I go back to the sentence. In 1948, they set up their government in North Korea. They were already planning the Korean War. In October 1948, Stalin's troops took over Manchuria. Now, all of this time, with Moscow's help to Mao Zedong exerted primarily through Moscow's influence over our government, that's the chief help that the communists were giving Mao Zedong, was through Washington, through their influence over our government. Mao and the Chinese communists were crushing their opposition in more and more of China, for while Mao's hordes had been given by Moscow all of the tremendous stockpile of Japanese arms in Manchuria, our government prevented Chiang Kai-shek's troops from getting even ammunition for the guns they did have by an embargo declared by General George Marshall. Marshall even boasted that he had disarmed 39 of Chiang's divisions with a stroke of his pen, which he had. And so by 1950, Stalin's agents had completed their conquest of the whole mainland of China. Now, I mentioned how they repeat great patterns, little patterns of parts of them. Let me point out here that of all the different things our government did to build up Mao Zedong, to destroy Chiang, and to help the communists take over, the most important single act probably was this one, which deprived Chiang of any chance to get ammunition even for his troops. The takeover of Cuba by Castro against Batista followed the exact pattern of the Chinese takeover in almost every way, except they didn't have to go through the tremendous atrocities. They had plenty, but not on the same extensive scale in Cuba that they did in China. But Castro was built up by our government. Batista was constantly undermined by our government. But the most important single thing was the embargo in March of 1958 against letting Batista have any guns or ammunition. He had over $1 million worth bought and paid for in this country, ready to ship, when they declared that absolutely arbitrary embargo in March 58 so that he could get no guns, no ammunition. Castro was getting all he wanted, getting them from submarines from Russia if he needed to, getting them shipped right from this country, small arms in cases labeled soap or anything you wanted to, and the bigger ones in stuff labeled piano boxes or pianos. And of course Romulo Betancourt he wasn't yet in official power in Venezuela, not till that fall, but he was already beginning to get rid of this little military junta that he'd had as a front to get the power, and he's helping Castro every way he could. Castro was getting all the arms he wanted, and Batista couldn't get any arms from any source. That was the most important single thing, following the same exact pattern by which they helped to overthrow Chiang and put Mao Zedong in power. To go ahead with the scoreboard advance, in May 1951, Moscow's invaders seized Tibet. Now, this originally was part of a public speech that ran for an hour to an hour and a half, and I was making this 2 or 3 years ago somewhere, and the question and answer period, somebody said, "See, Mr. Welch, this is why we don't pay attention to anything you say. We've all been seeing in the headlines that the communists have just been taking over Tibet, just here in the last 2 or 3 years. You said in your speech they took it over in May of 1951. And of course, this is the kind of short memory on the part of the American people that the communists count on. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, the communists took over Tibet in May 1951, as I've said. But it wasn't worthwhile to them, it wasn't important enough to go ahead and put the force in there to extend their police power all the way down. So they just seized it and let it run. And let it run until the time came, several years later, about 10 years later, when it was worthwhile going in and tearing the country to pieces and establishing their police state. It so happened in this particular instance that I had personal reason for knowing the situation a little better than I might otherwise have. In 1955, the then ambassador from China, from nationalist China, to Japan, the first one after the war, he gave a dinner for me in Tokyo in 1955. And at that dinner was the brother of the Dalai Lama of Tibet, who had just been released by the communists a few months before, had been held in jail by the communists ever since they'd taken the country over in 1951. I had a chance to talk with him quite a bit at that dinner. So anyway, the statement is true. In May 1951, the Moscow's invaders seized Tibet. In the summer of 1953, Moscow's agents imposed on us in Korea a truce so shameful in both the procedures of the negotiations as well as the substance of the truce as to be incredible in the light of past American history. Most students of the conspiracy know that the whole Korean War was a horrible loss to America in many, many ways, a great defeat in its effect, but they do not know that the worst part of that defeat and the greatest loss was due to the negotiations and the way they were conducted. It came about through the negotiations. Those negotiations, incidentally, were pretty well under the handling, control of Arthur Dean. John Foster Dulles and Alice Dulles' law partner in that law firm, of which every member of it is an extreme leftist, to put it mildly. Arthur Dean is the man, some of you may remember, who had succeeded almost single-handed in keeping Alfred Kohlberg from being able to expose the Institute of Pacific Relations. Alfred, some of you know him, he was a very good friend of mine, a wonderful American, there's never been a better one. Alfred finally, he's a very good man, he always wanted to believe well of everybody. When he finally woke up to what was really happening, he set out to expose the Institute of Pacific Relations from the inside. And he was stopped at every turn by Arthur Dean. And of course, he finally gave up and went on the outside and began to fight the Chinese communist propaganda so hard that they dubbed him as the China Lobby. And Alfred was called the China Lobby for the last 2 years of his life, sort of as a joke and a ridicule and so forth. Well, he almost was. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money not tax-deductible money either, in fighting the communists. I don't know anybody in America personally who's ever spent more and worked harder at it than Alfred Kohlberg. Well, anyway, comes to mind because of Arthur Dean is a man who succeeded in stopping him from exposing the Institute of Pacific Relations years before it was finally exposed. And Arthur Dean was in charge of our negotiations at Panmunjom. Now, you remember that I think it was MacArthur originally suggested that the negotiations be held on a battleship. Anyway, they wouldn't dream of that. Then they decided to have them at Kaesong. And it was set up to be at Kaesong, and they managed to get about 500 of their spies and agents and bully boys across the line under the guise of waiters and barbers and all of these servants that would be needed to take care of the dignitaries who would be at the truce, at the negotiations. Having got that done, then they moved it over to Panmunjom. And without ever letting, our people wouldn't let Syngman Rhee send these people back. So they had them at Panmunjom, and it became a complete Roman holiday of prestige building for the Chinese communists and of depreciation of us and our prestige and power and everything about it. The most important single thing that happened in connection of all of this was what we did to the prisoners of war. Now, these prisoners of war were not bona fide regular prisoners of war at all. Our military men in Korea had been very good men. The communists, again, wanting to have this war and wanting to have America knocked down and so forth, had been perfectly willing to have good, patriotic, able American generals lead our side of it. They were all very good. General Ammon and Mark Clark, and of course MacArthur and Van Fleet and the rest. And they were all very patriotic men. One thing they did was to issue, even drop from the air, flyers saying to the Chinese troops that if you've been impressed into the service, or you don't believe in communism, and you don't believe in what you're fighting for, you desert and come over to our side, and we will take care of you, and after the war is over, we'll send you wherever you want to go. And of course, anybody caught with one of those flyers in his hands was shot at once. They were gambling with their lives to even look at it. And despite that, there were thousands of them that showed up across the line somewhere, got across into our side, clutching one of those things in their hands to show why they were there. And we took and put them in stockades till it built up around 60,000. And then, as the truce negotiations got underway, instead of sending the so-called war was supposed to be over, instead of sending them wherever they wanted to go, which was to Formosa in almost all cases, we began to let the Russians send their interrogation teams through. This was on the excuse that these were all youngsters, 18, 19, 20, and for them to go to Formosa and leave their own country was a terrible thing to do, to expatriate themselves. They were too young to make that decision without being advised. And so that the Chinese communist Russians should be allowed to go through and ask them and argue with them and reason with them. Now, this was what they were after, was to get the names of their parents or their location, where they came from, so they'd could find out their relatives and threaten that they would have the names of their relatives and what would happen to them if they did go to Formosa and did not go back to Red China. It was so horrible that a Swiss member of the commission that was in charge wrote an article, it was published in the Saturday Evening Post, in which he said that he had rather have seen those prisoners killed outright. We just shot them all, then subjected them to the kind of humiliating mental torture that we put them through these interrogation teams by the Soviets. And yeah, we kept them there going through this and going through this. You can imagine how the feelings build up in some of these places. At one time, there were about 15,000 of these, nothing to write with, who managed to get enough paper, bark, or something, and a petition to be expatriated to Formosa. It was signed. They took a piece of wood splinter and scratched themselves. If they couldn't write anything else they could put an X, there was about, I've forgotten the number, so I better be careful, but about 15,000 had signed this petition, each one with his own blood, to be sent to Formosa. Well, you know what happened. We kept them there, and they were going to be shipped back to Red China. Exactly like 2 to 5 million of the same kind of people were shipped back to Russia, largely through Eisenhower's orders and under Eisenhower's command, in the beginning anyway, in Central Europe after the war in Operation Keelhaul. Well, this was going to happen to these people too. Syngman Rhee, with tremendous courage, with no warning, and he had to do it with no warning, just had the gates open one night and let 19,000 of them out. And just disappeared into the landscape. They disappeared and never were found. I told Syngman Rhee personally how courageous I thought that was. He was a little surprised to hear it from me. He was right in his living room in the presidential White House, whatever you call it, there in Seoul, talking about a lot of things, and I said I thought it was a very courageous and wonderful act. Well, coming from an American, it was a little surprising, and he looked rather wistful and sad and said, I just wish I'd had the courage to let them all out, to turn them all loose. And I know he had too, and I said, I wish you had too. It would have been fine. But this was one of the things that broke down. Here's America wasn't keeping its word to the anti-communists. It's willing to take these young men who had relied on America's word, that if you come on over, we'll protect you, and subject them to this kind of treatment, and then obviously going to send them back into the hands of the Red Chinese for torture and murder. Nothing could be thought of that to break down American anti-communist leadership, prestige, or our value as something to depend on the part of the anti-communists in Asia, more than that, or more than all the other things that happened in these peace negotiations. The whole peace negotiations were just incredible, far worse than the war itself. Now, to get back to the geographical advance, however, one result of this Korean police action and the negotiations was to strengthen the Kremlin's grasp and use of North Korea. In the summer of 1954, Ho Chi Minh and Zhou Enlai and other tools of the Kremlin took over the better half of Indochina. Now that completes the coverage of all those parts of Asia which became formal satellites up to 1954. How much further that kind of a blackout would have extended, but for a change in the Kremlin's method of establishing control, there's no way of telling. But that brings us to another part of the story. This time, 1954, Stalin was dead. And Malenkov and his associates, our subordinates, had already made clear that the Kremlin was in just as firm control of worldwide communism as Stalin had ever been. And the whole conspiracy, the whole conspiratorial apparatus was rapidly marching forward towards ultimate total victory. So rapidly, in fact, and so visibly that a different kind of problem now loomed ever larger before them. This was the problem of keeping the remaining free world, and especially the American people, from becoming aware of how fast and how surely the communists were taking over the rest of the planet. This has been their biggest problem ever since 1954. For this and other highly advantageous reasons, the new regime in the Kremlin called a halt to the establishment of formal satellites, called a halt for several years there. They began to extend their power through so-called neutralist countries. Now, these neutralist nations have posed, of course, as independent, but the governments have been and are, in one way or another, largely or completely controlled by Moscow. The difference between these dependencies, like Indonesia, and true satellites, such as Czechoslovakia or East Germany or Yugoslavia, is more one of form for the sake of expediency than it is one of degree. The people, of course, are bitterly opposed to communism. People used to say to me, Bob, how on earth can you speak of Indonesia being in the communist bloc? This is only 8 or 10 years ago they'd say this, or less. Speaking of Indonesia being in the communist bloc when 80% of the inhabitants of Indonesia are devout Muslims who hate communism with every breath they take. My answer was, look, 90% of the people of Poland are devout Catholics who hate communism with every fiber of their being. But certainly nobody can deny that Poland is a part of the communist bloc. Of course the people in Indonesia hate communism. And so do those in East Germany and everywhere else behind the Iron Curtain. And those in Indonesia have been held in line in support of communist plans and gradually brought under a communist police state rule, despite their futile and sometimes suicidal opposition, just as surely as were the people of Poland or of Hungary before them. Now, of course, I am well aware that there have been plenty of writers, commentators, and officials who were telling you, for instance, that Nehru was not a communist, but he was a dynamic neutralist. And some of them were telling you that even the Karim el-Qasem of Iraq was not really a communist, but merely an Arab nationalist who had found it necessary to accept Soviet help in order to maintain his nationalist Arab government. I want to pause a minute over Karim al-Qasim because he illustrates so many aspects of the communist conspiracy's methods and progress. He came to power on July 14, 1958. There was a seizure of power which had long been planned. Just how secret it was in many quarters is not known. Presumably, NASA didn't know anything about it, but I would doubt it very much, even though they were supposed to be bitter enemies. Of course, Qasim murdered the king. He murdered the crown prince and practically the whole royal family. But perhaps more important in some ways, he murdered Nuri as-Said, who was the greatest anti-communist, the strongest, firmest one, without question, in the whole Middle East, the one man who might have been able in time to stand up against Nasser and unite a lot of strength behind him. Nuri as-Said was murdered at the same time. Now, this certainly suited Nasser's future purposes without Nasser having had to bear the odium of the action. But Nasser, you'll remember, was our boy, as had been well known to and was well known to the chancelleries of Europe, although the American people never knew anything about it. And you never even saw it brought out in the writings of the anti-communists in this country, to any great extent anyway. The chancelleries of Europe, as I say, knew that Nasser had been financed in his climb to power by our CIA. Way back, since the days when he'd been a lieutenant colonel helping Naguib to betray King Farouk. And so Nasser was known by our CIA and our State Department boys and any real insiders all over the world to be a communist, while this was not yet so with regard to Karim al-Qasim, who had to make it known by following the one sure formula of showing his contempt and hatred for the United States and thereby gaining immediate United States government official recognition and support. Now, there were a number of Americans in the hotels of Baghdad on that day when Karim al-Qasim took over Baghdad. Some of them were probably wholesale sheep buyers. One or two of them may have been just tourist travelers. Nothing official at all. I've been right in those hotels myself, right there on the Tigris. And I could have been just as well have been there at this particular time, just as a tourist. Karim al-Qasim took every American out of those hotels and butchered them, and threw them in the streets of Baghdad. Nothing against them as individually or Americans. This was necessary to show his contempt and hatred for America so that our government would immediately recognize him. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that sounds terribly harsh and extreme and blunt, but that is truth. It's happened time after time. It was the pattern. This was a way of proving that he was a communist who meant business as a communist. And consequently, the communist influences in our government were able to go ahead and get him recognized at once. And by thus proving both his position and his intentions, he obtained the badly needed formal recognition of his regime in just a few days. If you think that I'm being a bit harsh, I am, but I'm still being truthful. And if you doubt it, I assure you it's because you have not studied the repeated use of this same formula by other communist upstarts in other countries or areas. Now, eventually, in February 1963, Qasim was overthrown and then executed. He'd served his purpose. And he now stood in the way of Nasser's long-range and grandiose plans. And to paraphrase Emerson, or extend his thought, Emerson said that when the half-gods go, the gods arrive. And among the communists, the half-gods must go when it's time for the gods to arrive. Nasser had to get rid of Karim al-Qasim. Now, most of you know that the Encyclopedia Britannica was taken over years ago, now completely run by Chester Bowles' lifetime partner, William Bentham. And consequently, if you know that, nothing about the Britannica today should surprise you. But you can get some idea of what we are up against today with regard to the media that reach men's minds, the problem of obfuscation, confusion, and deliberate falsehood we face from a sentence in this new Britannica about Karam al-Qasim, which begins, Qasim, quote, Qasim, fundamentally well-meaning, not undemocratically minded, and certainly non-communist, and so forth. That's the way the sentence begins, ladies and gentlemen. The guy who came to power by murdering the king, the crown prince, the whole royal family, and Nuri has said, and then Britannica says, Qasim, fundamentally well-meaning, and so forth. And it's an illustration of the new Britannica, I can assure you. Now, I went off on a tangent with Karam al-Qasim because he does illustrate a number of points, including that very bad one about immediate recognition by our government. But we were reviewing the people who claim to be neutralist and how it's been held true of so many of these people. And actually many of the common run of the commentators who claim that these people are really neutralists are perfectly sincere, of course. But the bellwethers of all such opinion molders are by and large the same people who insisted 25 years ago that Mao Zedong was not a communist but was an agrarian reformer. And they insisted as recently as 10 years ago that Ahmed Sukarno of Indonesia was not a communist but was the George Washington of his country. And only about 5 years ago, or even 4 years ago, many of them were still insisting that Fidel Castro was not a communist but was a revolutionary idealist and a young Robin Hood. And the widespread acceptance that so many of these views have had, ladies and gentlemen, is itself, in my opinion, merely another example and more proof of the terrific success of communist propaganda. For if you will take any one of these men as the subject of your objective scrutiny, forget everything else, and just decide you are writing an objective study of his life and of his actions, you will find that the evidence in support of his being and having always been throughout his adult life a tool of the Kremlin is simply overwhelming and leaves no room for doubt. We did it with regard to Nehru about 9 years ago, and we published the results in American Opinion, which at that time was one man's opinion. The evidence in his case, when you lay it out straight, as in each of the others, became completely overwhelming. Now, among these dependencies in Asia, where the rulership through such men as Nehru already, even by 1958, when I first put these notes together, belonged de facto to Moscow, were Indonesia, Burma, India, Ceylon, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Cambodia, Singapore, and even then probably South Vietnam. The anti-communist positions were already crumbling very rapidly in Laos, in Malaya, or Malaysia, whichever you want, in South Korea, in Thailand, in Iran, and practically everywhere else in Asia. Let's emphasize that by pausing a minute over Laos. Think about Laos in 1958. We published in 1958 an article that Laos was gone, completely gone to the communists. It's just a matter now of how much they wanted to do the gradual takeover, make it gradual, and use it for other purposes of keeping this strife and this battle going in Indochina, and this argument and this fuss and something to fight over. And the reason Laos was gone is because of what our government had already done. The leader of the communists, the Communist Party and Action Group, both in Laos, is called the Pathet Lao, P-A-T-H-E-T, then L-A-O. The leader of the Pathet Lao, the known leading top communist in Laos for years, has been Suphanoo Vong, part of that same Vong family that you hear so much about. Suphanoo Vong, a known, admitted communist leader of the whole communist activity. In about 1956, our government, following this scheme of forcing coalition governments on people, they did on Chiang back in China, they did it, supposedly did it, they even went worse than that in Lebanon, and so forth, insisted that Suphanoo Vong be taken into the Laotian government. In other words, the top communist was brought into the government as one of the ministers, member of the cabinet. But they went far worse than that. This is the idea is, you know, that, oh, you must have a democratic base. You must have your government represent everybody. And therefore, whether you like the communists or not, they must be represented in your government. So we forced it on them. There's nothing they could do about it. And Souphanouvong came in, but they went much further than that. They made him Minister of Rehabilitation. I believe the official title was Minister of Planning and Rehabilitation. And we were sending over, besides some military help now, there's about $40 million a year as just plain foreign aid money for a little tiny country of about 2 million or 3 million people. This money was supposed to be, as so many other things we do, to save the country from communism by rehabilitating it and planning properly. So, of course, the money, therefore, must be turned over to the Minister of Planning and Rehabilitation. And for about 15 months, I believe, we published it in the whole facts and everything. I've forgotten the exact length of time now. For about 15 months, every bit of our foreign aid money going to Laos was turned over to the chief communist of Laos, Souphanouvong, as a means of saving Laos from the communists. And this was typical of other things going on, except in this particular case, we published in our magazine the exact details, the whole facts and everything about it. A lot of people sent it to the State Department and said, what about this? What's the story? They got answers back they sent us, full of 3 pages of double talk that meant nothing. And that's the actual fact. So as I say, we just said Laos is gone. It's a matter now. Of course, what Souphanouvong was doing was using all that money to feather his nest for logistical purposes up in the hills and to get ready whenever he wanted to use whatever force as much as they wanted to use in the gradual takeover. And it was just a matter of when they wanted. In fact, all of IndoChina, ever since 1954, it's just been a matter of when they want to let the communists finally take it over. In the meantime, it's a wonderful means of having all kinds of fights and arguments and disputes going on, which the communists need and want all the time, everywhere. They create wars, struggles, battles, everything, because they must have a fight going on, largely with them controlling both sides of the fight in order to make their headway. Now, if you would take a map and mark up the countries I've named in red in proportion to the extent of communist control in 1958, and then mark red China and North Korea, North Vietnam, complete red, and study that map, I think you would have agreed with me that even then, in 1958, the communists had already gone 3/4 of their way towards the completion of the second step in their 3-step program, and this was taking over the mass and masses of Asia, 75%. They had gone all the way, practically, which is 1 out of 1 on the first step, Central Europe, 3/4 of the way on the second step, which is the mass and masses of Asia. Now, let's consider the rest of the world, the third step. And again, we must remember that the communists, while working hard at the immediate task of getting control of the mass and masses of Asia, and of making Fortress Asia the stepping stone for conquering the rest of the world, they have been looking ahead and doing everything possible, everything that was strategically wise from their point of view, to make their final undertaking both easier and more certain of success. It was already clear in 1958, for instance, and I stated it right in these notes which were used then, that the communists were using and planning to use Northern Africa as a part of their encircling movement for taking over Western Europe. Now, as you will see, again, by marking up a map, or just take one in your mind, this encirclement of Western Europe, even by 1958, it began, of course, with Russia itself and its immediate satellites on the north and east. Then you move around the Asiatic side of the Mediterranean. You had Syria, Lebanon, then Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, in all of which, even then, the communists either had a lot of control or were getting it. Of course, it was a fight the The situation in Algeria was not yet cleared up, and there was some opposition, but they were establishing their control over that whole northern ledge of Africa. Control, however disguised in some cases, or they were rapidly acquiring it. Then you jumped across Spain and the British Isles to the northwest. There was Iceland, which of course is one of the revealing things about the NATO hoax, because Iceland was one of the NATO countries to fight communism. Of course, Iceland's been under communist control, practically complete, for a long time. That's just one of the great jokes about Mr. Acheson's NATO. Then completing the circle, Norway and the Scandinavian Peninsula. And, gentlemen, Norway, if it were 10,000 miles away, is not yet so far gone that you could say it was completely belonged to the communists. Our scoreboard shows it 60%, as I remember. It's been about 60 for a long time. That's all the communists need, however, when it's that close, where it's right there under their thumb, and under all of the weight and pressure of the supposed great colossus, where they have enough control to make Norway practically a satellite. And for all practical purposes, it is. And Finland, still in completing this circle there, that's a great tragedy. The Finns fought bravely and long and hard. They fought especially hard back in 20 years ago, in the Karelian Isthmus. But the weight was too great. We never helped them. We went to all this World War II supposedly to help small nations, but we never did anything to help poor Finland against the takeover of the Karelian Isthmus by the Soviets at all. And of course they just couldn't possibly do it despite all of their bravery and courage. They couldn't stand up against the pressures, the infiltration, the undermining, and the pressure from the top. Until today, of course, nobody could be president of Finland. It wasn't run by the communists and working for them. And so that circle is pretty complete. Now, this has not meant that the communists have intended to have troops march in from this periphery and take Western Europe by force. Not at all. That's not the way they work. They don't have to. It does mean that the pressures and threats that have been exerted on the chancelleries of Western Europe from this encirclement, this gradually increasing encirclement, the aid that the communists have been able to give their agents in the governments and national activities of every kind in Western Europe, and the weakening of the remaining anti-communist strength in Western Europe through this encirclement without, added to infiltration within, it means that this overall communist progress has made the position of Western Europe very precarious indeed. Again, the question is not the ability of the communists to go ahead and sweep across Western Europe. They can sweep across tomorrow. But they don't move that way. They've got to break down their inside opposition little by little, gradually, so it isn't seen, it isn't recognized before they do anything like that. They can't take the chance of a blow-up that blows back against them. Actually, one of our very best-known writers for our magazine, who's himself a European, in fact, Willie Schlam, many of you know Willie and know how able he is and was. Willie Schlam wrote in 1958 that within 2 or 3 more years, the way they were going, the communists would be able to take all of Western Europe by telephone if they considered it strategically wise to do so. And I don't think there's any doubt that the communists could take Western Europe by telephone tomorrow. The third one of the steps, let me just repeat, the first was to take over Central Europe, the second, the masses of Asia, the third, the rest of the world, including the United States. We had looked at the first 2, and we're looking at the third one, and especially first at Western Europe. And of course, there's been a great deal happened in Western Europe. The communist progress along the lines in which they want to make progress has been terrific. They now have that northern ledge of Africa pretty complete under their control. They have Algeria completely so, in a way that not only was horrible for the Algerians, but also has helped to increase the communist strength in France terrifically. The way that Algeria was betrayed into communist hands, which we'll come back to in another connection later, had the effect of destroying anti-communist strength in France itself and increasing de Gaulle's power a great deal. Jumping ahead, and asking you to sort of take it for granted till we do get into it later, let me say that de Gaulle is as much and completely a communist as Fidel Castro ever was, always has been, nothing else. His whole record makes it absolutely clear. We shall have a number of pamphlets and books for you to take with you when we get through, if you want to. Some free and some you can buy if you want. But among those that will be free is a review of the Algerian-French situation, which we published as a special issue of American Opinion some 2 or 3 years ago, and reprinted as a dollar reprint called The Tragedy of France. Read the first 45 or 50 pages of it. We'll give you the, if you are not familiar, we'll give you the sequence of events in pretty straight order to show you how horrible the betrayal was there, but the whole record of de Gaulle, very similar to that of a number of the other communist viceroys. And the reason I bring it up here is that this encirclement and infiltration progress has now reached a stage that's fairly obvious, fairly determinable or definite. What the communists are working on right now, using their old encirclement principle, is the destruction of the Iberian Peninsula. They now have Franco and Salazar in an island, a real island, with de Gaulle and France, which is under communist control, even though the people in France don't know it, a lot of them don't, on one side, and on the other side is the whole, what I keep calling the Ledge of Africa, and the communists across the Mediterranean there. And so the squeeze is on, the way the communists always put it on, to get rid of that pocket, that enclave. And you've seen all kinds of things happening as a part of that squeeze. With regard to Franco, the biggest effort is to undermine him from within. They've gone a long ways. They work, the Spanish communist refugees work from outside the country, but still with an effort to undermine the Franco government as dictatorial, as fascist, and as every kind of thing that the communists can falsely claim. It is so bad that it was about 2 to 3 years ago, Franco himself made a very amazing statement for a head of state to make. He said, and he's a careful man with such statements, so you can be sure that he knew he could prove it. He said that the communist Spanish refugees in Venezuela, of course under Romulo Betancourt's guidance and protection, who were working to undermine his government, had the actual active help of the President of the United States, or of the White House, I've forgotten how he worded it, and that he had documentary proof to prove it, to show it. And I don't doubt that it was true. And the effort there is to undermine Franco in that way. Now, with regard to Salazar, they can't undermine Salazar inside. He's too strong. He's had too good a government too long. He did not have to fight his way in through a civil war, as Franco did. And, of course, in a different kind, in a more normal world, Salazar would long ago have stood out as one of the great statesmen of all times. Salazar became finance minister of Portugal some 33 or 4 years ago. I've forgotten the exact year, and I make no effort to try to get all these dates exact because it's not that important. He became finance minister first, and about 2 years later became prime minister. He's been prime minister of Portugal, running it pretty much as a dictatorship and running a corporate state, which is a form of government we don't like and nevertheless has its advantages there. But the point is that not only from the time he became prime minister, from the time Salazar became finance minister 2 years before to this day, there's never been a year that Portugal had a deficit. There's never been a year that Portugal didn't come out on the right side of its domestic finances with a balance. He's run an extremely able government from the point of view of economics, of the kind they run. He's run a very able government in another way. The governments of Western Europe have been the chief parties to the sacrifice of their colonies to the communists. It's the communist influences in London and Paris and Brussels and the Netherlands and the other countries, so-called imperialist countries, which have taken the lead in helping the communists to pretend that these supposed civil wars by these colonial peoples were justified, and that we must be modern and progressive and humane, and therefore allow these countries to have their independence. The independence, of course, being nothing but a transitory stage on the way to becoming a communist colony. But the governments of Europe, always pretending otherwise, have been the strongest parties, next to our government maybe, in the sacrifice of these colonial areas to the communists. They've negotiated them into communist hands, not Salazar. They've done everything on earth to try to make him and put the pressures. You go read the story of all the things they did to try to get Salazar to let Goa be negotiated into Nehru's hands. No soap, nothing. He wouldn't listen. They had to go into Goa and take it by force. It didn't take too much force after all. It's a fairly small enclave there in India, but they had to. And everywhere else you go, Salazar has been, and the Portuguese government, completely unwilling to even consider the negotiation of Angola through the phony stage of independence into becoming a communist satellite, or any of the other Portuguese territories, with the result that surprises most Americans when they stop to figure it out or study it, that outside of the Iron Curtain, Portugal is today the largest empire in the world. The others have been broken down and destroyed to the point that Portugal is now the largest empire in the world. And the whole effort with regard to Salazar in Portugal at present is to ruin him by breaking down his prestige and standing and strength and everything else by taking his colonies away or destroying the colonies. And this is what's behind what's going on in Angola and other parts of the Portuguese empire over the world. All the efforts of, I never can remember whether his name is Rolando Roberto or Hollando Robert or Roberto Holland. That's the funniest name. What is his name? Holland Roberto. Holden Roberto. I know the man quite well. He's one of the worst, most vicious communist murderers alive. You could almost tell that by the wonderful treatment he gets from our State Department of the United Nations. But he definitely is anyway, and of course his activities are aimed at breaking down Salazar, also creating the initial terror in places like Angola, which will terrify the natives and even the European settlers there, so they will not fight and oppose the next steps that come along, this form of terrorization that the communists use everywhere. But anyway, the effort is to undermine Salazar. It's gone a long ways. The effort to destroy Franco has gone a long ways. I don't see how they can withstand the pressures too much longer. But the drive is there. It's increasing all the time. It's an encirclement. And they will destroy that enclave and take it over. Now, when they do, you have the real thing ahead. When you have Spain and Portugal taken over, then you have all the way from the Rhine to the Mediterranean and the coast of Africa, France, Spain, Portugal, all in communist hands. And West Germany is left as a complete island. On the other side of West Germany, of course, you've got Russia itself and the satellites in northern and eastern Europe. And the only other things, what else you've got left is England on one side and Italy on the other. And of course England has become, as most of you know, a complete nonentity in this fight. The British government has been run by the communists completely for I don't know how long, 15 years or so. No matter which side's in or what, who the prime minister may be, the government is completely run by the communists, and even more so than ours. And as against it, the British people are even less informed than ours. That seems utterly impossible to some of us who know how terribly uninformed our people are. But the British don't have the slightest idea. They have been sold socialism to a large extent ideologically in the first place. They don't recognize it as a front for communism or as a medium through which the communists work. In the second place, they aren't interested. They're going ahead about their own weekends and affairs. I have a lot of friends in England and have visited over there a fair amount. And it's just incredible what the ignorance of the British people as to where they stand, what's happening. And they don't mean a thing in the fight anymore, except whatever power the British government can use to help the communists, which is being used for that purpose all the time, gradually, the way they want it done. On the other side is Italy. And it's probably the one country where the communists might have some chance of actually taking over by a legitimate election. Not that they'll ever hold a legitimate election, but Italy is so completely under communist domination that they probably could take it over by a legitimate election if they ever wanted one. And of course, they're not ready, they don't want it. But the point is that there's no help there. So you've got West Germany, which is the one area of anti-communist strength left, despite everything that's happened to it, in Western Europe, is going to be left as a complete island, surrounded by all of these communist territories and pressures. And in preparation for that time, the build-up, as the communists always carry out, the build-up for what they want, for the pressures to be exercised on West Germany as an island, has been going on now for some time and is very extensive and very vicious. You have seen a lot of the old movies that on the television going back 20 years to show that all Germans are monsters and all of them are fascists and so forth and so on. You've even had Adenauer being held up as a horrible fascist and so forth and so on. They count on the fact that the American people don't realize at all that Adenauer was kept in jail by Hitler for years. He was such a bitter opponent of Hitler. And one of the things that's been sort of fortunate on our side was that the occupation forces that ever let Adenauer in knew he was a socialist, and he always has been a socialist and still has. It's one of the things that later hurt because of his opposition to Earhart. But anyway, despite all of that, you find the American people being told that Adenauer is really a vicious fascist. All Germans are beasts. You have new books being written to prove it, all kinds of developments to create in the American people's mind again the willingness to see the communists swallow up West Germany, because that is the one bulwark left that amounts to anything against their takeover. So that is, too briefly, the position of Western Europe, and I ought to go ahead because that's just a part of this picture we are reviewing of the general advance in this third step. And that would bring us to the Western Hemisphere, where there have been a tremendous amount of changes in the 7 years since, as I keep repeating, I first put these notes together. At that time, although anybody could see the communist advance going on in Latin America, the number of countries definitely and completely under communist control were very, very few. They had taken over Guatemala and then backed out again, or backed away because it was premature without the approval of the top communist command. They did have Dr. Jagan, an avowed communist even then in British Guiana. But you remember at that time, Batista was still in power in Cuba, and the ablest of the anti-communists on the mainland of Latin America, Perez Jimenez, just been overthrown in Venezuela, and Rafael Trujillo was still going very strong in the Dominican Republic. Even then in '58, since Perez had been overthrown, you had only 3 truly anti-communist governments left. Well, you could count Batista, depends on what time. You'd have 4 counting Batista. You had even then Batista in Cuba, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Somoza in Nicaragua, and of course General Stroessner in Panama. And that's all there were. Elsewhere you had struggle going on, but no real anti-communist strength in any government. Well, of course, today, to skip ahead, you have Trujillo has been murdered, Batista's been driven out, and so you have Somoza and Stroessner only. And Stroessner has plenty of troubles with the liberals right there in Paraguay, increasing the problems for him and their power all of the time. And Somoza would be all right in Nicaragua if he didn't have anything but his own country to worry about. But you've got Costa Rica right there, which is up and down. It's a pitiful situation because you've got some good anti-communists, but of course the guy that is really the power there is Jose Figueres, the great hero of Harvard University and our State Department, the great Democrat, who of course actually has been a communist all of his life, and with no question about it. I wanted to interpolate something here, that in Latin America, and was in these notes before what happened in the Dominican Republic, In Latin America, the communists have been willing to use a technique they have not used hardly at all elsewhere in the world. They've used it a little, but not much, and that is the assassination of heads of state as a part of their progress. They have not used that much, despite they depend on murder, mass murders of any kind, atrocities and tortures of all kinds. Assassination of heads of state, they've stayed away from pretty much because of the backfire against them in world opinion. But in Latin America, it's been accepted for generations that a part of a revolution was to kill the guy who was the dictator and put a new one in. And so since that was part of the general pattern, the communists felt they could get away with it. And they've used it quite a bit. They assassinated President Ramon of Panama some years ago, and that was dirty communist business, because Ramon was a real anti-communist. Some of the stories of what was happening down there, we never had time to dig into far enough that I could tell you, I could guarantee them that you could quote them. And incidentally, whatever I am giving you people today, unless I do give you a warning, everything I say is fact, I assure you, can be proved. And if not, I'll say, well, this is something that we believe to be true. And in some cases, it's obvious that I'm expressing opinion. But the pressures that were put on Ramon when he was president of Panama to try to make him go softer on the communists, pressures by our government, were just incredible. And I was going to give you some of them, and I decided maybe I'll skip it because I couldn't exactly prove them without a lot of work. But they were, and finally he was assassinated. And of course it's been impossible to have anybody elected president of Panama since that wasn't working with or for the communists. And the situation down there, the dirtiness that's been done by our government to our own people who live in the Panamanian area is just incredible. We get letters all the time from people just pouring their hearts out, telling the truth of what goes on. Anyway, they assassinated Ramon. They assassinated the elder Somoza of Nicaragua. They assassinated a man who showed signs of being a truly great anti-communist, was Castillo Armas of Guatemala. And even before that, they had assassinated Colonel Aranda of Guatemala in Mexico, when he was the one presidential candidate who might have stopped Arbenz Guzman from taking over Guatemala, going some ways back. Now, since then, they have, of course, assassinated Rafael Trujillo. They let Batista escape. And Batista did not have the following or the strength or the ability that could ever be a serious danger to them. But they couldn't let Trujillo live, because Trujillo was the one man that might have been able to rally all of the anti-communist strength of all Latin America around him, if they did let him live. He was a very strong man. Maybe I should stop just a minute or two over that situation. There's probably been more lies about Trujillo than anybody except the ones that we all know, Chiang Kai-shek, Syngman Rhee, and Franco. Now, Trujillo was no white lily, no question about that. Most Americans don't realize that Trujillo was an American Marine. Began his career as a member of the American Marine, and he remained an American Marine in his thinking all of his life. And the Marines never were sissies or white lilies. But Trujillo gave the Dominican Republic a very good government, despite anything you've been told to the contrary. It was dictatorial. But it was not dictatorship that reached down to the ordinary daily lives and actions of the people. He had a constantly rising standard of living, a standard of education, slowly but all he could absorb, and a rising standard of personal freedom in the Dominican Republic. And he was very, very much loved by his people. One of the clearest evidences of that is what happened when Romulo Betancourt and Castro together sent that invasion in there in the summer of 1959. They sent that one big, huge plane load of people in that with the Revolutionary Army were going to start a guerrilla movement in the Dominican Republic to take over and overthrow the Trujillo government. And of course, the peasants just chopped them to pieces with their machetes, every one of them. And that was the expedition that caused Major Lanz to resign. The head of the Cuban Air Force was ordered to fly that plane, and he refused to fly the plane, which meant that he had to get out fast because his life wasn't worth a hang. But he could see by this time, he'd supported Castro up to then, he could see by this time that this was a complete communist proposition, and so he refused and got out. And Lanz has been in this country ever since, and incidentally is working for us full time now on our Speakers Bureau. But that is just incidental. Anyway, Trujillo was very well loved by his people and gave them a great deal of to be loved for. And he had too much following, too much strength, that they didn't dare let him live. They've used this assassination in Latin American countries more than anywhere else. Today, the communists are in complete control, of course, of Bolivia, have been for several years, despite the present fight that's going on there between Paz Estenssoro and Juan Lechin. And we've expected that fight to come for some time. Estenssoro, of course, has been called the president and is a political power. Juan Lechin is the labor leader who has boasted, for at least a dozen years, that he was more red than Mao Zedong. That if it's possible, he probably is. Of course, Juan Lechin goes to Moscow openly, regularly, for his orders. And he and Estenssoro worked together back in the early 50s when they followed the communist pattern for a takeover. They nationalized the tin mines on which the industry of an economy of Bolivia depend. They nationalized and brought about incredible industrial suffering of the workers, all of which they want, of course, always under the guise of the opposite. They nationalized the farms to bring about enough starvation and hunger so they could use the chaos as a means of installing their power. And of course they put themselves in power with American foreign aid money. Used it in this chaos they had created to reward their followers and see that the others starved. And it's the one case I know where the people who've done this have boasted of it. It's happened in other countries, plenty. It's what really made Menshikov important and put the Warsaw-Lublin gang in power in Poland. It's what Madame Sun Yat-sen used in China. All of it our UNRWA money back there at that time for this same purpose. But anyway, in Bolivia, Estenssoro, a few years ago, I don't know whether he was boasting, admitting, or confessing, but he stated that, of course, it had been America's foreign aid money that enabled them to install their regime and keep it in power, which it had been completely. And they've been in power ever since, despite the fight going on between them. I think that Juan Lechin will come out on top and become the established communist dictator or viceroy of Bolivia. But anyway, they own the country completely. They own Venezuela completely. Even though they do not yet have an open police state all the way down, Venezuela is just absolutely and completely run by Romulo Betancourt, who, despite all the pretenses to the contrary, is a communist, never has been anything else since he helped to openly found the Communist Party of Costa Rica when he was run out of his own native country as a young man of maybe 20 or 21 or something like that. He went through the pretenses, as so many of them do at a certain period in their career, as Castro did, as Sukarno did, and so forth. He went through the pretenses for a while of having broken with the communists, although he always admitted he was a Marxist, but he was not exactly a part of the Moscow communist group, which was a complete falsehood. Right while he was doing this, his book, The Politics and Oil, that he wrote, published in about 1957, the material was put together for him by a communist research agency and department in Mexico, and the book was published by a communist publishing house. Well, the communists don't do that except for their own people. And everything about his career is exact, typical communist procedure. If you get somebody working for one of the Standard Oil companies who's high enough up to be politically minded, you may get a dodging or a cover-up or so forth. Because don't forget, the key to most of the Latin American situation and the particular key to the Venezuelan situation is the incredibly close alliance between Nelson Rockefeller and Romulo Betancourt. They've been just like this for over 20 years. When Betancourt was first brought in power by the military junta in 1945, and ruled for 3 years, and it's always referred to as the time by the American press as when he was president before. He was never president before. He was head of a military junta that ruled the country for 3 years. The things that were done to take valuable oil properties away from native Venezuelans to turn them over to the Nelson Rockefeller interests sound like something that this guy Morris Beale would be accusing him of or something. I mean, it was terrible. And of course, they've been very close ever since. You remember Nelson Rockefeller has his estate down there. He went down there on his honeymoon with his new wife and so forth and so on. In the election in Venezuela in the fall of 1958, when Betancourt went through the motions of being elected, The peasants out in the back country voted by cards, different color cards, that's all they know, which card they voted with. They were told that if they voted a certain color card, why, when the land was taken away from the landlords and distributed, they wouldn't get any. It was Rockefeller money, can be proved, that helped to pay for running that election. I've talked to a number of the Standard Oil people from there who are perfectly honest and honorable, most of them are, and will back up, will tell you exactly what I'm saying. But you could run into, if you run into anybody that will deny the truth about Venezuela, it'll be from that particular slant. But the facts are completely there, that it's communist owned and run today, even though the police state has not yet reached all the way down. Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba you certainly know about. The Dominican Republic, our government is succeeding right now in breaking down and destroying any possible residue of anti-communist strength in support of the Trujillo family and in support of the anti-communist hopes there. Our government's even gone so far in this picture as getting rid of General Weisny, who's the one army officer that might have stood up and resisted. They put enough pressure to get rid of him. And they're closing fast in the Dominican Republic today to make it completely communist run. Juan Bosch has apparently been because he's not very bright, he's been a stalking front for them so they can make it look like that we are not really helping the communists because we are not helping Juan Bosch. Well, Juan Bosch wasn't even able. Juan Bosch has been a communist all of his life of the worst order. He's a protege of Romulo Betancourt and of Fidel Castro, a much younger man. He went and studied under Castro in Cuba for a while before that takeover, after Trujillo was killed, when they put Bosch in power, because he seemed to be the logical man. He was a Dominican expatriate or refugee. So they handed it to him on a silver platter, and he couldn't even hold on to it then. So although he's a complete communist, he's not likely ever to be pushed into too much power by the communists, or certainly not again. But anyway, he's been used as a stalking horse in this picture, and the communists are going to be in complete control of the Dominican Republic in very few months, if they're not already, all the way down. In many of the other parts of Latin America, as I say, only Somoza in Nicaragua and Stroessner in Paraguay have any real anti-communist strength whatsoever. One of the interesting situations is Brazil, and they did have a revolt there against Goulart and threw him out. Even before that, it had been quite a peculiar picture. Quadros himself was probably a communist, and why Quadros ran, unless there was some way that Goulart had of putting enough pressure on to frighten him and make him run, it's hard to tell. But at the time it happened, Goulart, of course, was visiting his friend Mao Zedong in Peking, or Peiping, whichever you want. And everybody knew that Goulart was an out-and-out communist, and he didn't dare come back yet. He's the vice president, he's the successor, he's supposed to take over. But there was enough anti-communist military strength still left in Brazil. The army still had enough patriotic fervor and ability that Goulart didn't dare come. He circled his own country, you remember, for several weeks, getting closer and arguing and making negotiations until they finally came up with some provisos. They'd let him come in as vice president and take over the country, provided he would sign certain guarantees, which he did. Of course, once he'd come in, become president, it meant nothing. The guarantees meant nothing whatsoever. They never do with men of that kind and with the communists. But this was all the army was able to get done. In the takeover of any country, one of the final and sometimes the final obstacle the communists must overcome is the patriotic fervor and strength of the military forces. The military, of course, have been trained to be patriotic, to be loyal, and it's very deep-rooted, and they are many times perfectly willing to give their lives for the country, unless they're deceived into doing it when it doesn't serve that purpose. And there has been a communist movement for 20 years going on to destroy not necessarily the number, but the strength and the fervor and the patriotism of the nationalistic armed forces of different countries. And because the military are trained to be so patriotic, they accept a lot, go on obeying orders from communist bosses ahead of them a long ways until it's always too late before they revolt. That's the pattern over and over. It was pitiful in Indonesia, when the colonels revolted there in Sumatra. They did it too late. If they had done it a year or two before, they might have had a chance. Of course, actually, we know they didn't have a chance anyway because our government would have seen that they were destroyed. But even when they did revolt there in Sumatra, they were able to gather enough strength and put up enough show that our government started sending arms and ammunition to Sukarno in flying boxcars. He couldn't even wait to go through the motions of pretending to sell them or of shipping them or anything else. We flew them out in our planes in a hurry to give Sukarno what he needed in guns and ammunition to destroy the colonels in Sumatra. But they had revolted too late anyway. It's happened over and over, and the destruction goes on very subtly and very smoothly. Now, in 1945, what I'm going to bring out here is that the parallel between Romulo Betancourt and Charles de Gaulle. It's very close in many ways. In 1945, Betancourt was brought to power by a military group who thought they were doing what they called the democratic thing. They learned otherwise. They found that they brought a dictator, and some of them found they brought a communist dictator in. So in 1948, it was a military group that threw him out. And he was a refugee from his own country until 1958. When in early 1958, his front people got together enough idealistic young army officers and so forth who thought they were doing the right thing, and they overthrew Pérez Jiménez and set up that junta. Little by little, Betancourt began to get control exactly as planned, then ran for the presidency and was elected. Inaugurated in January 1959, with an awful lot of the Venezuelans heartbroken knowing what they were doing, what they had done, and what had happened. He did it by all kinds of trickery and a phony election. It's shown by the fact that the day he was inaugurated, the city of Caracas, of 1 million people, was like a city of siege and silence and nothing except his tanks rumbling to be sure that there was no uprising the day he was being inaugurated. But anyway, the thing I'm coming to is that what he set out, the first thing he set out to do this time was to destroy the army. He knew that he had had a military group overthrow Pérez, and then he had pushed them aside, and that sooner or later, as in 48, there would be another military group of good patriotic Venezuelan military people would throw him out. So he set out to destroy the army, and he followed in the beginning, he could go further later, the exact pattern Charles de Gaulle followed in his second destruction of the French army. Now, de Gaulle is probably the only man that ever lived that destroyed the army of his own country twice in one lifetime. Of course, he destroyed the French army completely in 1944 and 45 and 46 in the contrived destruction of Darlan and of Giraud and the others. If you want to get all that story, 2 or 3 places. One is Cicely Huddleston's France, the Tragic Years. It's a great book by a great liberal, incidentally. Huddleston was always a great liberal, but he knew the truth about de Gaulle. Or de Carrilis. De Carrilis was de Gaulle's top man in America. Some of you may have known him back in the World War II years when de Carrilis was a very important man. De Carrilis later learned the truth about de Gaulle and wrote a book about him. You get all the facts of how de Gaulle was working for the communists all this time to destroy any opposition they might ever have afterwards, including the French army. And he practically destroyed the French army in 44, 45, and 46. Then, of course, we have those years in between when he retired to Columbia deux Églises as the elder statesman, and little by little was supposed to come around to where he was no longer such a lefty, and he fooled people into bringing him in to save Algeria from the communists. That's quite a picture. There's one of the great betrayals and deceptions. But anyway, when he comes back to power in May 1958, the first thing de Gaulle has to do is plan to destroy the French army, because sooner or later there's enough patriotism and fervor left. I imagine St. Cyr is a great institution because they have certainly, through many things, they've come out, they've sent out good men in the French army. And so the first thing de Gaulle did, he had to move carefully, was to begin wherever there were 2 or 3 generals close enough to each other, with their detachments or their commands, to get together and counsel and talk, who were patriotic French generals, and he knew that, was to separate them. He began to move generals around so that none of the good ones could get near each other together, that it became known in France as the waltz of the generals. And after he'd done enough of that and he got more power and felt surer, he began to move them around so fast, or demote them completely, and put others that he knew he could trust as being left-wing or pro-de Gaulle or even communist in command. Some wit in France said it's no longer the waltz of the generals, it's a foxtrot. And that's the way he began. He took a lot of other steps later, and of course the OAS picture came into it, too far to go into here. Well, Betancourt followed the same pattern exactly. That's how he began in Venezuela. Was moving around and shifting around any of the loyal, patriotic military so they couldn't get together or combine and so forth. It's worth mentioning here that a part of the Betancourt picture that tied right into that was the actions of the so-called Castro communists. Another one of those phony breaks. The communists used these phony breaks like the one between Stalin and Tito. We published in 1952 in a little book of mine, may God forgive us, several pages to show that it's impossible. Anybody knew anything about communism, there couldn't possibly be a break between Stalin and Tito. It was phony as a $9 bill, and for obvious purposes. Well, this supposed break that's been between Castro and Betancourt, it's as ridiculous as anything in the world. There's been no break at all, but it serves their certain purposes of great deception. They have to have deception to take over the world. What's been happening there is that the communists in Venezuela, from the time Betancourt got himself established in power as president in January 1959, began killing off the anti-communists. Well, it couldn't be done, obviously, with Betancourt's supposed knowledge and blessing. It's not the way the communists work, and he's still being held up as a great Democrat and so forth and so on. They call themselves the Castro communists. They go around and they attack wherever they can a group of anti-communists and kill them off, and then maybe they get arrested because there's enough anti-communists in the army and the police force to be following a reasonably legal pattern. They arrest these fellows and they put them in a prison, and of course in about 3 weeks they are released on a general amnesty from Betancourt, the president, on the grounds that it's terrible what these Castro communists are doing to my regime, which is trying to be so democratic and so peaceful. It's horrible, but we must all be progressive and realize these things, so we have a general amnesty and release them. Or if he didn't dare do that, and he had to keep them in jail, why there'd be another troop of supposed Castro communists that would come and attack the prison and let them out, and probably kill the wardens as a warning to the others. And the same guys that had been doing this murdering of the anti-communists were then free to go out and murder some more. And with Betancourt sitting there all the time put-putting and tut-tutting, and isn't this terrible, I'm trying to run such a good regime, and here Castro and his communists are making so much trouble for me. And of course all of it was planned by Betancourt, and part of the whole deal to kill off the anti-communists. Well, now I got into that tangent from the army picture, where he was destroying the army, and he kept on using different efforts to destroy the good men in the army and carried it far enough till by the time they finally revolted, there finally was an effort to throw him out again, as they had done in 1948 and as they had done to Paris in 57 and early 58. Why, they were too weak and he had too much power, and it was very abortive. In fact, they had one fairly sizable one and 2 or 3 smaller ones, and they were all abortive. He'd been smart enough, had enough experience, that this one chance of getting at him through that last bit of army patriotic strength failed. Well, now this has been a picture all over the world. It takes me back to Brazil, which is where we started. When Quadros fled and Goulart came back, the army made this deal, certain provisions that he guaranteed. They meant nothing when he came in. But the fact that they had enough strength even to demand and get some kind of guarantees was interesting. Let me just finish the tangent before I get back to Brazil. It's going on all over the world by all kinds of means being used, and ladies and gentlemen, you can be sure it's being used in this country. The removal of General Walker from Germany and what happened to him, he wasn't dismissed, as you know. He resigned. He resigned despite they'd rather have had it the other way if he was willing. My understanding, I believe to be true, is he was offered 1 stripe up, or lieutenant generalship, and command in Hawaii if he'd just keep quiet and stop fighting the communists. I've never asked Ted about it and checked with it, but I believe that to be true. And the thing is, however, they took a good army officer with a great career, good career. Nobody could pick any fault in it whatsoever. And showed what would happen to any man who really insisted on fighting the communists. And this went on at the same time that all of the censorship of the military, the muzzling of the military was caused to stop these people who were making anti-communist speeches. At the time, the really patriotic ones were being tossed around. I know one four-striper in the Navy, in command of a sizable area, who told me personally, he said, I just couldn't take it, but I've got only a few more months before I'm out. He said, maybe I'm being unpatriotic. I don't think so. I'm doing my best. He said, I'm even having classes conducted and so forth, and I'm catching hell over it. He said, but I'm going to try to, without any real blow-up, last for the few more months until my retirement. I know another place, and several people in this room know the other place I'm talking about, because it's right in this area where a very good Navy high officer command was removed, and I guess he was sent to the Aleutian Islands or someplace simply because he was insisting on being anti-communist and trying to give anti-communist instruction to the people under his command and the civilians in the general area. And you all think of cases where men have been demoted or pushed aside or other people put over them because the other people were more left-wing, more willing to go along, and the ones being pushed aside were firmer in their anti-communism. It's going on in the American Armed Forces very strong. It has been for quite some time. It's a part of that effort all over the world to break down by every means and all the usual communist subtleties, pressures, to break down the really patriotic resistance of the American Armed Forces, exactly as has been used in many other countries. Now, this started by talking about Brazil. We go back to the fact that Quadros came in, and he immediately began to put communist measures into effect, plan all kinds of so-called agrarian reform, which is merely taking the land away from its owners and claiming to turn it over to the peasants, actually as a means of national collectivization of it and other things. And apparently he was moving too fast for the communists, I would gather. They weren't ready to go quite that fast. He was forcing the issues pretty rapidly in Brazil. So as you know, he was overthrown by supposedly anti-communists. And some of the really truly anti-communists in Brazil were quite happy and quite excited. And we have some very good friends down there of the society that at this particular time were quite excited and quite happy about it. We refused to enthuse, much to their amazement and sort of puzzlement. We refused to enthuse at all, because whereas Branco probably is anti-communist, there are some anti-communist leaders in Brazil who've taken the leadership in this picture, and since this is being tape recorded and will be played other times, I'm going to skip calling any name here maybe, but one of the leaders, we have very serious doubts but what he's a stalking horse or a leader for the other side. Very much the same kind for a long time. I'm not at all sure, but what the anti-communist leadership in Brazil, I'm not at all sure that it is really anti-communist, is the point I'm making today. And that's one of your problems all over the world, is the leadership really anti-communist or isn't it? Brazil is in a state supposedly of reaction against some of the extreme communist movement today. How long, how far, I don't know. In the other countries of Latin America, you have a fight going on. There's no real anti-communist strength whatsoever. I've taken too long on Latin America, but the point is that the whole total continent, including Central America, is slipping right square into communist hands very rapidly, and of course with the tremendous help of not only our government generally, but specifically of our Alliance for Progress.